I'm very pleased to introduce you to our situation here. And I will first speak to these guys there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for everything. I'm not the kind of person who would regret anything in life, but today I do. I deeply regret I don't speak your language. I missed out the speeches and tried to understood a little bit, but it's a big regret. I will try to work on it.
Okay.
It's okay?
Say something.
Okay.
We are really impressed and we are happy to meet you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your coming.
Thank you very much. I got this invitation back in August, and as my lawyer, Mr. Rothman, wrote to me, the title would be Stress of the Mother, Consequences for the Unborn and Born Child. When I got this invitation, I was surprised. I said, nothing wrong with me. I don't have any problems, but whatever is for sure, I ask my children, because once you're not sure of something, you ask your children. My daughter told me she's 47 years old. She met my mother, loved my mother loved her, and she told me, all my life as her life was about the Holocaust. I had to be independent at age 4 to be able to go shopping, because the Holocaust could happen. At age 9, I had to know how to use public transportation, including subways in Toronto, and I had to go by myself to downtown to your office, because I had to defend myself just in case the Holocaust could happen. When I told you I am afraid to give birth, you blew up. You are afraid? With clean hospital, doctors around you, nurse, you have a husband beside you, you have a nice clean home to go home. What are you afraid of? Look at my mother. She gave birth to me. She didn't have nothing, no future, no nothing. We were constantly told with my brother, this generation would never survive the Holocaust. So, in which household is normal not to throw out potato peels or leftover food? And the list went on and on. It would take another month to you to sit here and listen to her, what I did to her. No one lived through the horror was ever okay again. Never had a comfortable night's sleep. My mother, all her life, she carried these and many more scars, both physical and psychological. I'm going to speak now about the stress and trauma what my mother went through.
Jetzt kommt die Geschichte dieses Traumas, durch das die Mutter ging.
My story begins with my mother, an educated woman from Budapest, Hungary. Her father was an architect. To this day, you can still find his name on buildings in the city. Her mother was an intelligent and sophisticated woman from a cultured family. They had French nannies, and my mother spoke perfect French, Hungarian, Slovak, and German. After finishing high school, she could not go on to university because Jews were no longer allowed a higher education. Instead, she got a job as a nanny for a very young motherless boy. In Sarospatak, the city, she met my father in March of 1943. They were married. As a young couple in love, they lived a happy, ideal life until 1944, when the Nazis invaded Hungary. The morning after Passover in April of that year, there was a banging at the door. It was the gendarmes, the local Hungarian militia, who were worse than the police, said my mother. My parents were forced from their home in Sarospatak and herded in the cattle car train, which took them to the ghetto in neighboring Sátoraljaújhely. Because it was the day after Passover, they did not have even bread to take with them on the journey. From the middle of April until May 22nd, we spent our last days as a family together in the crowded ghetto. We, because my mother was pregnant. Then we were forced again into a cattle car on a trip that lasted 3 days. On May 25th, we arrived at the living hell of Auschwitz. It was traumatizing. We, in my mother's belly, were beaten and herded by SS men with whips and machine guns, shouting, "Everyone out, schnell! Leave your bag on the train." There were SS men standing in watchtowers with machine guns and spotlights on us, watching the chaos. From up there, the madness may have seemed orderly, but down on the platform, it was not. To her dying day, my mother was afraid of barking German shepherd dogs because of that day. Everyone who came to Auschwitz stood in this line until and spit at Mengele. To the left were sent women who showed signs of pregnancy, children under 15, the elderly and frail. These were the ones to be murdered immediately. Everyone over 40 was sent to the left as well. They were told, "Hang up your clothes, you are going to take a shower." And they believed it. These Jews were not showered. Instead, they were gassed. My mother was sent to the right, which meant temporary reprieve from death. When it was her turn in front of Mengele, my mother told him that she was pregnant, hoping he would be compassionate and would let her stay with her friends. She had already been separated from my father and would never see him again. Mengele snapped, "You stupid goose," ordering her to the right. She was good stock, healthy and strong enough for forced labor. The same had happened to my father, but he did not survive the inhuman condition and he died of exhaustion. No, that isn't right. He was murdered by exhaustion. In an interview with her granddaughter for a school project, my mother described what happened next.
In einem Interview mit unserer Enkelin, die das für die Schule machen musste, beschrieb meine Mutter, was dann geschah.
After arrival in the labor camp, I got tattooed. From that moment on, I wasn't Vera. I was age 60, 75, totally shaven, given a uniform and the wooden clocks, the shaved heads, the tattoos. They were symbols of our dehumanization. All our dignity was taken from us. We no longer counted as human beings. My mother was assigned to work the night shift in the warehouse in Camp A that contained the personal belongings of the victims. Here my mother's job was to pick out anything of value that the Jewish victims had brought with them from home. My mother had to sort and separate everything into separate piles: shoes, linens, clothing. If the prisoners stopped working or worked too slowly, they were beaten. The SS took the finest clothing to be disinfected and distributed to the German population. When she was 5 months pregnant, my mother was transferred to Barrack 2, where she was assigned to an Außenkommando that worked outside the camp. Then she did heavy physical labor, building roads and working in the fields later. She told me, if we found plants in the fields, animal food, not even meant for human consumption, there was a celebration among us. It was as we found treasure, like a Sachertorte. We shared it, we ate it. They ate animal food and celebrated. Later, my mother was assigned to the kitchen duty. There she managed to scrunch some potato peels. The only reason I was able to remain alive in her belly, as she said, because of the vital vitamins in the potato peels. The rest of her daily diet consisted an ersatz coffee in the morning, made from water and burned wheat, that was given in the morning and night, and it was later found out some chemical bromidine spiked, so ladies won't have their period, and kept inmates tranquilized. Sometimes warm soup made from grass for lunch, or from rotten vegetables, and a very little tiny slice of black bread. Once, my mother found in her soup a piece of bone. She was so happy to have that small bone, and the assessment saw it and kicked her below the knee. She spent all her life with a limp and a blackened right leg because of the bone in the soup she found. Their bed, if I can say bed, it was dirty straw lining, and 6 people had to lie on it. If one had to turn, all 6 had to turn because they were like sardines in a can. Imagine a 3-tier bed. The bottom place was more comforting. The middle bunk bed had no air, and the top was blowing wind, rain, or snow. My mother was forced to do very hard physical work, so she went to the broker test and told her, I am pregnant. Under the rules of Auschwitz, this confession meant she would be sent immediately to the gas chamber. Instead, she was sent to a Barak Camp C. There she took care of children, especially twins, who were used for medical experiments by Mengele and his fellow colleagues who called themselves doctors. Later, my mother became a human guinea pig for Mengele's team. In October, when she was 7 months pregnant, Professor Clark Klauberg's team selected her for sterilization experiments. They injected a burning substance into her cervix. Right behind in her uterus was the fetus, me. These injections were terribly painful. Injection 1, and the fetus moved to the right side. Injection 3, the fetus moved to the other direction. And they played that game for a while. Those experiments are the reasons I do not have any brothers or sisters. Somehow I survived. After they finished observing the effects of the injecting caustic chemicals into my mother's cervix, my mother went back to her barrack and luckily was forgotten about by the angel of death. Because she was fed so little, I was so tiny that the pregnancy didn't show. If not for this, we would have been killed before I had taken my first breath. When my mother was 8 months pregnant, a Hungarian woman doctor, possible Gisela Pearl, who worked under Mengele and knew about my mother's pregnancy, came to the barrack one night and offered my mother an abortion. She told her, when you give birth, we don't know how Mengele will react. If he is in a good mood, only your child will die. But if Mengele is in a bad mood, both of you are going to the gas chamber. You are so young. You could save your life. My mother promised she would think about it and give her an answer next day. The night, in a dream, she saw her mother and begging her, Verushka, the fetus is a child already, almost ready to come out. Trust in God, and you will be helped. Don't have an abortion. The next day, she gave the doctor her answer, a definite no. At that time, there was another woman who had given birth, and Mengele bound her breast, wanting to see how long the baby would live without being fed. Shortly after, both the mother and the baby were murdered. My mother was not sure of the day I was born. All she knew was that it was 3 days before the SS celebrated Christmas. So if they celebrated on the 24th, my birthday was on the 21st of December, and if they celebrated on the 25th, then I was born on the 22nd. On the day I was born, my mother told the blockade tester, who was a prisoner from Czechoslovakia, that she was in labor. Since her father had been a doctor, the blockade tester knew a little bit about what to do. Somehow she managed to get a sheet, some hot water, and scissors. She told my mother to go up to the top bunk. In the barrack, the bunks were 3 on the top of each other. She went up after my mother and helped her give birth. That is how I came to this world, in a barrack filled with children, none of whom knew I was born. I was so malnourished that I weighed 1 kilo and was unable to cry. This was the only reason I survived. 3 hours after giving birth, my mother had to leave me alone in the bunk and go outside for roll call appel. To this day, I am amazed that my mother was able to do this. What courage, what incredible strength to be able to do that. It was December, it was freezing cold, and she only had rags for clothing. My mother had to stand uphill for a long time. It was winter, and the wooden shoes the inmates wore were dangerous because of the ice and the snow. If she fell, they would shoot her. She was shivering, no clothes, no shoes, but one thing was burning inside her. I have a child. I have to save her. The whole time she was praying that I would still be alive when she returned to the barrack. Imagine the stress. One day, not long after, a few days before the liberation, my mother heard people yelling, "Schnell, schnell!" The German guards herded the surviving inmates like my mother into a tunnel, banned the camp, and told them they would be blown up inside. This not happened, but her last days, my mother retained a mortal fear of tunnels. In Toronto, where we lived, many decades later, she had a panic attack because the train got stuck in the tunnel. On January 27, 1945, Auschwitz was liberated. That day, another child was born. His name is György Faludi. He lives in Hungary. György's mother did not have any milk to nurse her son, so my mother fed both. That was the beginning of our long friendship between these two mothers. After liberation, as the men broke into the SS storage room and were able to get food, the men came to the women's barrack to look for their relatives or find someone from their back home. My mother met Mr. Polgar, who was from the same city as my parents were. Mr. Polgar reminded my mother that baby need a birth certificate. My mother was not interested at all in paperwork, but Mr. Polgar, he insisted, and went into the town of Auschwitz and to get the document that shows my place of birth. Yes, yet in this madness, many miracles happened. My mother was starving and yet she had milk to nurse me, and after the liberation, even another woman's child. From the food they gave her, she had maybe 300, 400 calories. How did she have milk? A miracle. But I'm not here to talk about miracles. My mother only was able to return to Hungary with me in November 1945. Through Katowice and other Polish cities, a long stay in a Russian DP camp, Slutsk, my mother came back to Budapest to look for a doctor who could help us. I was a very sick baby. In November, when I was almost a year old, I weighed 3 kilograms. Any normal baby is born weighing 3 kilograms. My mother went from doctors to doctor, but none of them had any hope they could help or that I would grow into a healthy baby. My mother was the only one convinced that I would live. People used to call her a crazy woman. They thought she had lost her mind in Auschwitz and that I was just a doll in the carriage because I couldn't move. I didn't look like a human baby. I looked like a rag doll. My grandmother was begging my mother, her own daughter, listen to the doctors, let her die. She'd never be a normal child. But my mother was determined. One doctor held me upside down like a chicken and said, if she raised her head, there was a chance that I might survive and he would help. I did. After that, he cared for me for several years until my bones were strong enough to walk on. For a while after returning to Budapest, we stayed in my grandmother's house. My mother frantically looked for my father meantime, but no answer. She decided we are stronger and she will go back to Sarospatak. If maybe my father will come back, he would wait for her there. Later, when she realized he was gassed, married my stepfather, who lost his daughter and his wife. My stepfather adopted me. I was a very young baby at the time. I grew up seeing a beautiful marriage. They loved each other, they appreciated they are alive, and they were desperate to rebuild their life, trying to put back of their mind the horror they experienced. My mother loved me more than normal. And my stepfather was partnered with it. Probably he saw his lost daughter in me, and I was the lucky one who enjoyed that. Our rooms were decorated with pictures of relatives, and when I asked, who are they? The answer was, died. They purposely didn't use murder to frighten a little kid. We did not have any relatives. I had a childhood friend. She was born in Budapest during the war, but in a hospital. She was 3 weeks older than me. Her biological father also was murdered, and her mother, just like my mother, married a much older Holocaust survivor. Both families decided they're not going to tell us kids the adoption. Somehow we knew our fathers were married before and they had children. Our weekly game was with her, we cried for those who we lost. So she was the winner because she said she has to cry more than me because her father had twins. So we had Vera's, my stepfather's murdered daughter, clothing and her mother's untouched in one of the closets. Today's mind would not understand that. I was begging to my father to let me wear Vera's clothing, and because anything I could ask was possible, in his eyes, he gave me her skirt. I refused to take it off. I was so proud to wear it. We suffered with my friend, we don't have any family families. Her biological father's mother visited every summer in my friend's house. It didn't make any sense who she is, but we still called her a grandmother and her last name. Again, Susie was the winner. At this time, I didn't have any grandmother. She survived the Holocaust, but after, she was falsely accused of something, put in jail, and taken away and killed. That was the Hungarians. I cried endless hours. All my classmates had grandmothers. They spent the summer times at grandmother's house. Those days were not in style children's camp or summer camp. Still today, here in camp, the word gives me shivers. It does not come to my mind summer camp. The first impression is lager camp. To me, all those sweet memories from my kids' camp life still hits me the word concentration camp as a first impression. From the entire basically 3 families, we only had one aunt stayed alive as she was saved by Raoul Wallenberg. The borders were closed, we were cut off from each other. From my stepfather's side, his first wife had a living relative. She came to visit in town. Susie and I, we had a fight. Whose relative is she? We both wanted to sit in her lap because she was a relative. The relative had strep and she didn't want us in her lap, but we pushed in our way. We craved to hug her. We find a relative. I still remember the dress she was wearing. I was 12 years old when someone asked me, like Polgar, he's not your father dead. I still remember the story it happened. I still remember the lady's face who told me that. I still remember how I dropped the merchandise and what I was supposed to buy and run home screaming and crying. What is she telling me? Then they sat me down and they told me the shortened story of my life. It made sense, the pictures on the wall. Who are they? And the answer was always dead or later murdered. I got older, it was murdered. My mother never spoke about these horrors to anyone. An inner voice told her that nobody could understand these experiences except only those who had been through them. There is no use talking about them. Even I wouldn't believe them to be true. As a survivor, Esther Bauer said, the first 20 years we couldn't talk about it. For the next 20 years, no one wanted to hear about it. Only in the next 20 years, people start asking questions. Between each other, they came together and talked about it. Usually I was hiding under the table and I heard bits and pieces. I saw the tattoo number of my parents' arm. I heard some of my parents' friends come crying. She never were able to have kids after Auschwitz. And some of the ladies she was together occasionally came to visit us from different towns. They took an interest how I am developing. I saw many times my mother woke up in sweat and upset, but she told me someone was chasing her and she brushed it off. She had endless nightmares. My speech was good. I spoke before I was able to sit up. To cover for the outside world my troubles, like I can't walk, they had made me a little carriage and they pulled it to make to the kindergarten or school. Later, walking was still limited because the bones were so fragile. They ordered a little car custom made so I don't have to walk. It was working by little pedals. But still, my legs were too weak. Therefore, my father pulled the car. I was spoiled beyond imagination. I refused to eat. It was many tears to feed me. I was tiny, always the smallest in class. Once the doctor told my mother, don't feed her. Let her come and ask for food. She couldn't take it after 24 hours. They had to force feed me. Feeding time was by us. I run first, and then my father, the maid, whoever could catch me and put a piece of food in my mouth. I was very social, loved kids and people, very protective to my friends. As a little girl, I was very careful not to hurt anyone. Once a scary-looking lady asked me if I could give her a kiss and a hug, and I looked at her smiling, thinking, and I answered, I will send it to you by mail. I never intentionally wanted to hurt anybody's feeling, but I was extremely sensitive. I couldn't take it if somebody was yelling at me, started to cry. I cried very easily. When I reached the school age, the learning was not easy. I had difficulties to learn how to read. I had difficulties with math. I did not understand the concept. I was lucky because we were 53 children in the class, and the teacher did not pay too much attention of my difficulties because he knew my mother is tutoring me day and night. Today's word, they would say learning disability. I outgrew it.
Heute
Then grade 2 I was fine. I caught up. You probably think I was not mature yet for school. I was the oldest in the class because I was born in December, and my mother held me back not to start it before 6. Spite of everything, I was a good student later, loved school, loved the belonging to the class, and I was quite popular. My mother was the guiding force. Education was her priority. And she wanted to expose me from music to ballet, the sport, for everything to expose my interest. I was a very happy child, surrounded with love, which made me very strong. We were financially stable and looking forward to the future. My mother dedicated all her time for me. She didn't work in the house, she had help, just concentrated on my health and happiness. Continued even my adult life. Her word was, who loved me was a good person. Then she loved the person. But if anyone looked at me the wrong way, God save the person. Once a teacher hit my hand, and that teacher was her colleague, she was a teacher, with a ruler. Probably I spoke during the class. My mother got the ruler, went into the teacher's room, and hit the teacher's hand. And he said to him, I brought this child back from hell. Do not dare to touch her ever again. My parents had a positive attitude toward their new life. They cherished the freedom. They appreciated the flower on the table. Their home was a positive environment. We felt safe. If we look all the aspects, what we know today, how the babies develop, it's really unexplainable how my brain developed, how spite of all the chemicals my mother breathed in the constant poison air from the crematoria, the malnourished her body to provide me. These are all has no logical answers. How am I here? The constant fear of losing me or her life. The constant appeals twice a day in the freezing December without shoes or clothing. The constant screaming of the Germans. The barking German shepherds. The constant fear. The beatings, she told me. She was petrified because rats constantly jumped on me, and she was afraid if she is not there, they will bite me. Still today, I have a terrible fear of mouse and rats. How I wonder how her stress level was. Her determination to survive and save me was beyond imaginable. I did inherit this determination. I did inherit her positive outlook. And no matter how tragic life was, Nothing was impossible for us. In my childhood, the Holocaust every day did not come in. My birth circumstances were not known, and my mother did not want to tell me about Auschwitz. As I reached puberty, I became overweight. It bothered me, and my mother tried to help me, taking me to doctors, endocrinologists, but they find everything normal. Things changed when I got pregnant. I got in panic. Yes, nothing wrong with me, but maybe it skipped a generation. Maybe my unborn won't be normal, maybe. Then I spoke to my doctor, who was very kind and kindly told me, there are many researches, and if I come out okay, the unborn will be fine. When I was in the delivery room, I was not afraid at all, self-talking to myself. If my mother, under those inhuman circumstances, without future, gave birth to me, who am I to say a word? What reason to be afraid? After my daughter was born, he smilingly told me, as far as I know, you and the boy are the only babies born in Auschwitz. How would I have any research? After my daughter was born, my motherly instinct about Holocaust came to the surface. I started to experience antisemitism. I was a social worker, and one of the teachers constantly complained about the kid. When I pushed her for explanation, she said, he's Jewish. I hate him. How do you know he's Jewish? His name is Grunwald. At that time, my name was Gross. I left the school. I went to change my name. I was expecting a baby. No one will hate my baby because she or he has a Jewish name. My husband was mortified. For 30 years, it was good for Gross. Nothing stopped me. I changed it. This is how I am Orosz today. When I left Hungary with my family in 1973, my mother came before me to make it easier for us. We had to leave illegally. We came with 2 suitcase summer clothing for a family of 3 because we didn't want to get any attention while leaving the country. I learned from the Holocaust. In 1944, they didn't want to leave because until it was too late, because they believed in their comfortable life, I left behind without hesitation. Everything, car, house, nothing mattered. Even my ring, by mistake, I left in the drawer. My mind was, get freedom. I learned from the Holocaust. When I was young, my mother did not want to tell me about the Holocaust. She told me very little. My daughter was 16 and she has a school project, and she interviewed my mother where she told all the horrors she went through. My daughter taped the interview, so we have it. For her, she talked. When I lost my mother, I felt I can't go on. Then I remembered, what would she have done? What would she tell me? She would tell me, you have 2 kids. You have responsibilities. Go on. I had a fear to learn how to drive. After her death, I took driving lessons. I got my license. It wasn't just the driving. It was to face the fear life without her. Until her death, I didn't think the imaginary umbilical cord was ever cut. Daily, we called each other 4-6 times a day. She loved me, she protected me, she spoiled me with no limit. I felt always safe until I had her. I truly believe this undivided attention, undivided love toward me made me what I am today. Balanced, happy person who can appreciate small things in life. Still today, after the legacy of Auschwitz, of my mother's starvation and abuse, never disappeared completely. I stand less than 5 feet tall today. I'm overweight in spite of many diets. I have high blood pressure and many infections when I am stressed. Even if I have a dentist appointment, which I am worried, I tell myself, come on, in Auschwitz, what they would have done to be able to cure the pain with a dentist. Whenever I have a fear, I think, what would they have done in Auschwitz? Then the fear goes away. When we have a 26-hour fast day, I tell myself, you worried? Your fridge is full after the fast. In Auschwitz, your mother kept Yom Kippur, and they weren't sure the Nazis will keep for them the daily portion till tonight. But they kept the fast. I never thought about these things until you invited me and looked into it. It was a regular life to me. That was the normal. Auschwitz was part of it in many ways, but to me, it was a regular life. I didn't know better. Although after the war, my mother seemed to have put the horrors of Auschwitz into the back of her mind and lived as happy and loving person, when she lay dying of cancer at the age of 71 in Toronto, the nightmares came back. She saw Mengele standing at the door of her hospital room. No amount of morphine could make him disappear. She died on January 28 because January 27 was the liberation of Auschwitz, and she said she just not want to die that day. I apologize, I tested your attention span. I'm very sorry, but somehow I didn't count the time for translation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your impressing words and for sharing your very, very personal story with us. Thank you so much. So we'll take some time for questions or comments, okay?
I would like to tell you, I have internet, I have FaceTime, I have Skype, I have email. Any questions for your research, I gladly answer. And whatever I could help for your research, I will do in my best interest.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your coming today.